Welcome to the Curiosity Crisis. We challenge ourselves to explore the world of business, tech, investing, and science. Get curious and be part of the journey as we discuss, challenge, and learn.
Today we're speaking with Darren Kane, the Chief Security Officer at NBN, the National Broadband Network. Darren has been the CSO at NBN since 2015. Prior to NBN, Darren served in the federal government law enforcement agencies for over 19 years, in the Australian Federal Police and the financial markets regulator, the Australian Securities and Investment Commission. In 2020, Darren was appointed to the federal government's Cybersecurity Industry Advisory Committee to help guide the implementation of the nation's cybersecurity strategy and provide ongoing advice to address emerging cybersecurity challenges. We believe this perspective will provide a really good foundation for our listeners to understand a complex and evolving space that applies to us all. Welcome to the show, Darren.
Thanks, Luke. Hello, Kush. Looking forward to the opportunity to speak to you both.
Thanks so much for joining us today. So we'd just like to kick off with a question that we always ask all of our guests, which is, what's been keeping you curious at the moment, Darren?
Well, I've got to say that in very early May of this year, I had the opportunity to travel across to the US West Coast, where at the RSA conference, which is the biggest cybersecurity conference in the world, I had a personal conversation with one of the greatest sports coaches of the last 20 years, particularly in the from 2020 through to 2024, probably as well known around the world as any successful sports coach during that time. And he really recommended at the time that I be curious and not judgmental.
Okay. Do you mind who was the sports coach?
Well, I'm sure by saying be curious and not judgmental, I would have thought two fellas with such a strong understanding of sport and Netflix, you'd know exactly who the sports coach was.
I'm not sure, if I'm being honest. Kush, have you got any ideas?
Geez, you're embarrassing yourselves because I was actually told when I had the opportunity to join the podcast that you two were very informed. Of course, it was Ted Lasso.
I was thinking that. I should have said something.
You should have, Luke. You should have. Now we look bad for not guessing.
Yes. So what's been keeping me curious? That conversation with Jason Sudeikis around making sure that I'm not judgmental, that every time I have an opportunity to query something or express an opinion, stop and think and be a little bit curious about what I'm going to say and what were the circumstances before I become judgmental. And I think if the world today took a little bit more of that on, the geopolitical situation, which is really one of the things I'm most concerned about, would not be in the state that it currently is.
And as Ted Lasso says, believe. Isn't that
Very,
right, Darren?
very much so. And I must say, what you get on that television show is exactly what you get when you meet him in person and you listen to them talk. And he deliberately wrote that script and acted that part on the basis of what he truly believed in.
Wow.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. Yeah.
I didn't know that. I'm in season 2, so...
Yeah, he is what you see.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's epic. I'm gonna have to give it a watch, get into it.
Yeah, can highly recommend, yeah.
You obviously... You've never seen Ted Lasso, Kush?
No, I haven't. I'm admittedly terrible at TV shows and movies, so I need a bit of a push to get into them. But,
that is a distinct failing. It had its success, obviously, during the lockdowns of the pandemic. You know, everyone else around the world that actually wanted to watch something to believe has watched it.
Yeah, okay. Well, one thing I do watch, Darren, is AFL, or the Australian Football League for Australian listeners, and I know you're a massive fan of that magnificent game. You support the Sydney Swans in my home city now, but you live in Melbourne, and you're an absolute diehard. How do you survive when they play in Melbourne and get around the noise?
Well, look, I am a very big supporter of the AFL, but all teams. I actually just enjoy the game of footy. I am an old South Melbourne Football Club supporter, originally born in the country town of Diniliquid, so New South Welshman by birth. So when the South Melbourne Football Club, for the sake of its survival, decided to relocate to Sydney, the New South Wales capital, it made sense for me to follow. And I must say, from 83 through 94-5, before we got Tony Plugger Lockett, it was a desperately bad decision. Other than Warwick Kappa, Pink Helicopters and Dr. Edelston, it was a very, very sour time for all. But I've got to say, I attended the 96 grand final against North. We were unsuccessful. Attended the 05, the 06 grand final, where we were beaten by 0.06, but won in 05, of course. Was it 2012? Was it 2016? Was it 2022? And we have only missed the finals, I think, twice in all that time. So I've had a magnificent run, and very pleased and proud to say I'm a passionate supporter of the Sydney Swansbush.
No, I'll give that to you. Their home ground is about 20 minutes from my house by foot, so I hear the roars. I've gotten to a few games myself, but I'm your rival. I go for the West Coast Eagles because West is best, and we've had a couple of big clashes across the years.
If West is best, why don't you live there?
I like to explore, chase opportunities.
Yeah, and employment.
Yeah.
It helps.
Yeah. Hey, one of the things we can talk about very quickly around the Sydney Swans is the importance of culture. And one of the things I do want to leave your listeners with today is my firm belief in the importance of culture and the engaged folk that support a footy club like the Swans, but most importantly, the actual participants in that club. And what they all believed in is a common purpose. And I think if you can actually develop that and actually display that, you will be a very strong team and very difficult to beat.
So, Darren, if you don't mind, I'll get into one of the cybersecurity questions. I'm sure you've engaged with all kinds of people. How do you look at and define cybersecurity, especially when you're just talking to the average person?
Okay, so I'll make sure that we're factually correct. So I'm the Chief Security Officer, but I am a direct report of the C-suite, and I have sort of single accountability for managing security risk for the enterprise that is Australia's biggest critical infrastructure project, the National Broadband Network. How do I describe to people what I do and define cyber? So it's pretty simple. We've rolled out connection to around about 8.6 million plus homes across the country and some small businesses. In the last census, around about 2.46, 2.5 people per each residence across the continent. And as a result, 8.6 times 2.5 gives you nearly 18 odd million Australians are connected by the NBN. And then, of course, you've got about 83 to 85% of all data that crosses the continent on a daily basis, crosses the network. So when people say to me, well, Darren, what do you do daily? I say, well, I protect the spine of the Australian economy through ensuring reliable and secure connectivity. Because we all know now that it really wasn't infrastructure such as road and rail that saved this country's economy during the pandemic lockdown. It was connectivity. So the importance of having reliable and secure connectivity is an essential service nowadays. A utility as useful as water and electricity. So my job is to make sure that that's secure. And then if you want to talk about, well, how do I actually describe the technicalities of cyber and my day-to-day? Pretty simple. I'm aware that we are sometimes a target of perhaps state-sponsored cyber criminal gangs, state-sponsored attacks, hacktivists such as anonymous and religious-based groups, and even script kiddies. They're all folks that may have nefarious intent against Australian entities, including the NBN. But I don't want to become too technical, so I actually try and explain it by saying, I defend the NBN against crooks online. And security risk is nowadays just a senior business operational risk that everybody has to manage. So it's a risk like any other. And my role is to make sure that the company understands what our appetite to that risk is, and to ensure that I actually try and keep the risk within the appetite by putting controls in place to manage it.
So when you talk about some of these risks, give us just a specific textbook example. So one of these groups, anonymous or a state-sponsored group, what is that? Is like an attack on personal data? Is it trying to break into systems? Is it trying to shut down critical communication between organisations?
Well, one of the better examples, instead of using NBN as a potential target, you think of the Ukrainian war and the attack on utilities from a cyber perspective prior to the invasion by the Russians. So what they were trying to do is disrupt both the critical infrastructure source and the economy of that targeted country before the invasion. So what you've got here with what I gave as a description of NBN, and then you look at companies like Telstra, or you look at an energy company, these critical infrastructure companies are all potential targets to nation-state sponsored attacks by cyber criminals who want to shut the joint down if they had nefarious intent. But probably more likely is a ransomware attack, phishing attack against senior executives, and so forth. So there's examples of what I speak about when I talk about the actual risks.
Yes.
And the other issue to understand, Luke, Kush, is the motivations of these risks. Sometimes and most likely they're financial. So can they actually extort money through ransomware from the companies? They may be political. They could very well be religious in today's environment. There could be people that are just disgruntled, are looking to disrupt, or genuine nefarious intent to intercept and interrupt an infrastructure's capability because they can, to prove how smart they are.
Yeah. So then on maybe the flip side of that, having worked as a CSO at NBN for almost a decade, have you encountered any common misconceptions in the cyberspace that have just caught you out early in the role, or what you warn potential new staff about as they come in? Like, what misconceptions have you picked up?
I think probably the one that annoys me the most is the fact that we don't depict what I do in a current form. Quite often you'll see a hooded figure behind a green screen, a green code and hoodies in basements. This whole area that we operate and manage on behalf of these entities has moved on. We've literally gone from the basement to the boardroom. Senior directors of boards across this country and across the globe now are very, very aware of the downside risk of security attack, particularly cyber, which is what we're speaking about now. And they actually want to appreciate and gain better knowledge on what controls they have available to actually manage that risk. So what we've got to do is actually stop depicting it as, green screens and people in hoodies. This is a significant sort of criminal enterprise globally, which is making an enormous amount of money by attacking global technology platforms, applications and networks. So I think that's the first point. I also think that it's very difficult now because the security risk that we speak of isn't one that you can clearly define as simply cyber or information security risk. I think there is a cross-pollination nowadays of physical risk with personnel risk, and then, of course, with information security risk. And they're all actually one large sort of event that you actually have to actually work to manage. So I'm someone who believes in a converged or all hazards approach to managing that risks. I don't think you can actually separate information security from physical security, from actually background checks and other things around personnel security. I think all of the data that you gather in relation to those three should be contained and owned by a single accountability and effectively managed.
Yes, it's all integrated.
That's correct.
That makes a lot of sense when you're considering other risks. For example, engineering risks and administrative controls are all part of the same hierarchy, and they all come and act together to help protect, in the first instance, people. And
an example of that, Kush, is that my title is Chief Security Officer, whereas a popular way to describe some of the cyber aspects of my role is Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO. So I'm definitely the guy that says drop the I. I'm someone who actually declares that you should have a single accountability for all security risk as a common ownership, rather than splintering information security under one pillar, personnel security perhaps under the HR director, and physical security perhaps under someone who's responsible for facilities. I think that's an approach which doesn't allow for efficiencies and a more effective way to manage it.
Just a quick intermission. Thanks so much for listening. If we could just ask a quick favour, If you could send this to a friend and recommend it, we would greatly appreciate it. It's easy to do and it helps the show out. Thanks. So we have a lot of Australian and international listeners. I think about half of our listeners are now international. And I was wondering if you could give some examples of common cyber threats that kind of anyone could experience. I know that you mentioned a couple before. You mentioned phishing, and then you discussed some organized crime. But yeah, do you have any that, like, whether people that you know have come across, or it's just something that faces a lot of people?
Yeah, look, it's funny, because if we use the word cyber, you've probably got to define it. Now, cybersecurity attack is generally incidents of malware payloads, encrypting data, shutting down systems, and even cyber extortion, the threat of exfiltrating that data and releasing it on the dark web. That's a form of cybersecurity attack, but ultimately it is cybercrime. Now, cybercrime today is sort of defined as digitally enabled crime, if you can think of it like that. Now, let's talk about digitally enabled crime, which is what cybercrime is. And as a sort of a product of that, you have cybersecurity impact. Does it make sense? Right.
Yeah.
So the most common, I think, is social engineering, where that's digitally enabled crime, but it's not necessarily a breach of cybersecurity.
Yeah.
Okay. That's where your details are scraped, that you actually voluntarily put up on a social media post, things like Instagram, Facebook, Meta, LinkedIn. And by using that detail, the actual crook is able to identify a profile of yourself and then use that with nefarious intent against you. So that's social engineering. By actually getting your details, Luke, and scraping it the way I've just mentioned, they're actually able to actually formulate a phishing attack against you, or even an SMS scam, a digitally enabled scam where they actually know enough about you to convince you that you should click on a link, which may have a payload of malware that will encrypt your systems, or convince you to actually provide them money. There's all sorts of different scams. There's financial scams, there's romance scams, there's pet scams, charities, online shopping. In the case of NBN, which is not an uncommon one, quite often callers will attempt to encourage people to believe NBN have rung them to get remote access to their computers. And I often go on radio or present at presentations where I actually encourage people not to do that and to understand that NBN will never contact them directly looking to get remote access. Smishing campaigns is another one, ransomware campaigns. So there's a myriad amount of different digital enabled crime types, and some of them will use cybersecurity incidents to enable the crime, and the example of that is ransomware.
Yeah. So on that, I have some stuff to pick your brain a little bit later in terms of where you think the industry's going. But before we get there, is there anything that obviously you've learned from your experience in cybersecurity that you've brought home to your family and friends and just people around you that you tell them to implement?
Oh, well, when I first started way back in 2004 with Telstra, back in I think 2006, I was appointed the Net Trust and Safety Officer at Telstra for Big Pond, the first of the really large ISPs in this country. So I learnt far more about cyber safety back in those days, which enabled me to better understand. And back then, in some ways, certainly social media wasn't a thing and hadn't grown the way it had. And even the iPhone, I think, was pre those days. We've become such a connected world, whether you be at home or in the workplace. So ultimately, as the Chief Security Officer in the workplace, I've had to become the Chief Security Officer at home. One of the things I've had to do is ensure that all people, whether they be at home, be in the workplace or out enjoying themselves, socialising, they have to take responsibility for their own security online. That is the key message that I give everybody, is that it's no good abrogating your responsibility and passing that off to somebody else and saying, oh, they should look after me. No, if you want to post details on social media, you be responsible for what you post. If you want to actually put a password in to protect your data, you be responsible for the length and the protection of that password. I also sort of aren't someone that will often blame the victim. So these scams nowadays have become more and more sophisticated. So I don't victim blame. That's another thing I take home. I recognise that people are busy, and sometimes they really don't mean to click on a link or don't mean to push a button. But ultimately, muscle memory and even a fat, lazy forefinger means you do it before you realise it. I'm someone who will actually make sure that folks understand that some of the most basic controls you can put in place can be the most effective. Strong passphrases, really example. Protecting those passphrases. Keep your antivirus capabilities on all of your endpoint devices in place and upgraded. So when an upgrade is available to be installed, make sure you do it in a timely fashion. Ensure that most of the applications you use online, particularly banking, airlines, or anything that you use where you get personal data, are protected by multi-factor authentication.
Yep.
If they haven't got at least 3 or 4 levels of defence, start querying them. So they're just basic examples of some of the things that I actually take home from the workplace. And I'd encourage all your listeners to understand that and make sure they do the same.
I think that's a really good takeaway. Yeah, I appreciate that, especially for listeners who are not really sure what they should do. I think there's some really good examples there. Pivoting back to NBN, I saw that NBN posted quite a humorous video on YouTube of you titled Darren Kane or Darren Kane, and it was spelt wrong with one R and an I. And it was a video covering phishing scams, which we've mentioned before. And if you're unfamiliar with phishing, it's spelt with a PH. It's a type of cyber attack, and it's trying to trick individuals into giving sensitive information. So what role do you think that organizations like NBN, but not necessarily NBN, play in promoting cybersecurity awareness to the general public when it's something that does affect everyone?
You're talking about that very bad acting.
No, that was fantastic acting.
Yeah. Now, look,
No comment.
Firstly, let's talk education and awareness. As a security chief, I believe that education awareness of customers, employees, and anybody is one of the real proactive levers and one of the only proactive levers a person in my role has. So I'm huge on it. I firmly believe that the way you communicate the potential risk has to be basic and easy to understand, thus that video you speak of. I think the NBN, for example, who provides connectivity, has some ownership of ensuring that the customer base that we actually provide. Now, we only provide wholesale broadband connection via retail service providers. We never go direct to the household. Yep. We'll actually go direct to an RSP. But having said that, people do iconically recognise the NBN as the actual medium that connects and protects them.
Yep.
So I think we have a responsibility for providing advice on what they can do around avoiding scams or being aware of what the types of scams are. Probably most importantly, I think we've got an important message to push out around when the NBN is being used as part of that scam. For example, when people ring up and say, we're from the NBN, we think we need to actually test your speed, we'll need you to go to the computer, and they'll try and convince individuals that it was a good idea to have the person on the phone from the NBN remote access their computer. We never ring, we never do that, and that's the sort of messaging that I think the NBN has a responsibility for pushing out, and that's why I'm heavily involved in it. I'm also someone that's been doing it for a very long time, and I'm really passionate and committed to that. On average, I participate in awareness events almost once a week. And events like this one is a really good example of where we can really push the message out. We run campaigns to support big awareness days like Scams Awareness Week, Safer Internet Day, which is every February, Privacy Awareness Week, and the ACSC's monthly campaigns to actually educate Australians. So I think, the NBN plays a big role, and I think the security industry should play a bigger role in managing the messaging around education and awareness on these issues.
I really enjoyed listening to that takeaway about education. So when I used to work in cybersecurity, something that we would say is our greatest weakness is our people being unaware. Because so often, like we were talking about social engineering before, it's a gateway into an organization, you know. And so people being educated is a really, really important part of that. So just off the back of that, actually, you mentioned NBN impersonation scams. And I was wondering, how do you kind of deal with that? Like, what measures are there to reduce those sort of incidents? Because it's a tough thing, you know, someone saying that they're you and you know they're not. But, you know, how do you deal with that? Yeah.
Well, firstly, the fact that we are such an iconic brand, everybody now recognises the NBN as connectivity. which is a powerful tool. The downside, of course, is that people sometimes suspect that as a result of that being such an iconic brand, that they will eventually be contacted by the NBN. So therefore, the responsibility is ours to ensure our end customers, or end users we call them, and all of the RSPs appreciate that we will only contact them in certain circumstances. And it would be a very rare thing to contact the customer directly.
Yeah.
And the areas where people ring up and often complain that they have been dealing with an impersonation of the NBN, we use that as examples on when we would never do that. So we would very rarely contact the end user, and we would never contact the end user to seek payment, to ask to do remote access speed tests, or to encourage individuals to do anything other than if we knock on the door, we'll actually present credentials to identify ourselves, and it may be to move the vehicle off a pit out the front or something similar so we could get access to do work. Yeah. Sometimes we've got to be really careful about our awareness messaging, because there are certain circumstances, for example, a vehicle on a pit, where we may ask it to be moved, but we do very, very rarely contact the end user. So, look, the upside is everybody recognises and knows who we are, which is great branding. Yep. The downside, of course, is those with nefarious intent, crooks and others, will use us to their own advantage.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe, and then also maybe the lack of knowledge of end users that don't know that the NBN will never contact them, that you go through internet service providers or the companies that you mentioned. They're the ones that would be getting in contact if they needed to do anything, and there'd be a set of security loops to get through. But
very, very well said, Kush. And that's where you've got to be really careful that individual RSPs may have different methodologies around contacting and dealing with their customers. What you don't want to do is get caught up trying to explain how that works. So what you try and do is actually keep the messaging around the NBN and what we do as simple and understandable as possible. And to your point, Luke, before about people and the importance of people, certainly my mantra in dealing with security risk is people, people and people. Unfortunately, people are probably about 85, 90% of the problem. The really pleasing part of that is they're 100% of the solution.
Yes.
That's huge.
It's true.
Darren, you talked about the risk in social engineering, and then these scams that can build off of a profile, that can be made of you and then used to target you with. And it's obviously something that people might be sick about hearing in terms of AI and the buzzword around it, and that AI might be changing the cybersecurity industry. But where do you see it headed with the increasing accessibility and capability of technologies like AI? Is that going to be more dangerous on the cyber attack side or potentially the cyber defense side, do you see?
Let's be really frank firstly, Kush. AI, cognitive AI, has been around for a very long time. So machine-based learning, automation, that's AI in its lowest form. Okay, so artificial intelligence has been used for data science, data analytics, data engineering for a period of time. Behavioural analytics has been able to be assessed and used effectively by companies for many years now. When you refer to AI in the circumstances you've just have, I'm assuming you mean generative AI. Large language models and now small language models. Okay. Yes, they represent a significant change in the way we operate and live our lives. This is generative AI. There's significant hype around it, but as you actually see this start to grow, there is enormous opportunity that humans can actually gain from using it more efficiently and effectively. With that comes obvious risk. The first is validation and ability to believe what it is we're being told as an outcome from a prompt. Okay. Once we continually get to a stage where, just as Google question is seen and then believed, once we get to that point, we will see an acceptance and an acceleration of capability of large language models, small language models. So if you're not experimenting with AI at the moment, in a generative AI in your role today, you may face being left behind. That's at the moment. There was a great quote from Emad Mostak, the founder and CEO of Stability AI, where he said that AI is not going to replace humans. Okay, so understand that. But humans with AI will replace humans that don't use it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
Okay.
actually talked about that on our AI episode where we covered, it's an evolution of tools. And
That's right.
And people need to evolve with them.
Yeah.
Exactly what you're saying, yeah.
And now, on the flip side of that, there are those individuals we've spoken of previously who have nefarious intent. And they've got a very powerful tool that they can utilise.
Yeah.
So issues such as deep fake and other capabilities, be it malware, social engineering, generative AI will also make it more and more sophisticated as a scam and make it more and more difficult to identify.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to use AI to combat AI, if that makes sense.
Yep.
See, that's the stuff that sort of blows my mind. And maybe the other bit that gets me is like it goes from potentially a quality game to even a numbers game, because potentially with AI you could attack just like another order of magnitude of people, because you've got the AI running the social engineering scams, gathering data, putting together profiles, and then running the same scam across another order of magnitude of people, and then one might slip through the cracks, and that's your in. So, yeah.
So what you're sort of saying there is that the individual with nefarious intent, with the assistance of an AI tool, only has to get lucky once. But the person like myself who's responsible for defending against an AI tool by using AI tools has to be right 100% of the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that gives you a better understanding of what it is we're trying to actually achieve.
Yeah.
And that's why being abreast of every available tool and the evolution of that tool is so important. It goes back to what I said. You should be experimenting with AI. You should be understanding of what it can do for you and how you can improve what it is you're actually setting out to do. But most importantly, don't hide from it, because that's your advantage.
Yeah. Darren, that is cracking advice, and I think a very, very good place, perhaps a cliffhanger to leave it on. We're out of time. We're up to the last question, and it's a question we ask all our guests. It's actually my favourite one. Now, you're the Chief Security Officer at the NBN. You've worked in law enforcement across ASIC and on the Cybersecurity Industry Advisory Committee. So you've had a hell of a lot of experience and had a pretty illustrious career behind you. But what we like to ask our guests when we finish is, what do you want to be when you grow up?
You've obviously seen me in person. I hope I don't grow up any further. Look, I always wanted to be a professional bodyguard working with the Federal Police. Was what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I did get an opportunity to do some of that, and very early on, back in the 80s. And I found that to be really quite boring. I then became an organised crime detective, and I really enjoyed that. But once you've done that once, you've done it. I was a financial markets investigator and enforcement officer, which was really interesting, and it really lit up an understanding of how money markets work. But probably most importantly, and I'll leave it with you, because you've got such a storied and opportunistic career in front of you both, you've got to get a role or a job that every day you learn.
Yes.
And I can honestly say that ever since I joined Telstra back on the 4th of June in 2004, and the continuous engagement with telecommunications and information technology since that day, there hasn't been one day that I haven't learnt something new or learnt something valuable. So what do I want to keep doing? I want to keep learning.
It sounds like you're aligned heavily with our message on the podcast, Darren.
Yeah. Be curious, not judgmental, Luke.
I love it. Yeah. Well, thanks heaps for joining us today. We really appreciate the insights that you've been able to give us and our listeners. And we really appreciate you coming on the show.
All right. Good luck, fellas, and look after yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darren. Thanks for listening. Find us at curiositycrisis.com and Curiosity Crisis on Instagram. We're on all major streaming services, so you can listen how you like. Got to ask a favour. If you got anything out of this episode, please send it to a friend. Your recommendation is worth a lot. So thank you, and catch you on the next episode.